Hello, and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. For years, the military has been faced with the reality that for decades, water contamination on its bases and installations throughout the United States has affected the health and well-being of service members, military families, as well as entire communities that have hosted the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines since the early 20th century. It is also the reality that the military has dragged its feet in the matter, not surprising. The major culprit of contamination is what is called per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, otherwise known as forever chemicals. As of August 2023, the Department of Defense has confirmed that more than 700 military bases are likely contaminated with PFAS, which are man-made, fire-resistant, and repel water, oil, and grease. They've been used in firefighting foam called AFFF on the basis since the 1950s, but are also used in clothing and food containers to make them water and oil repellent. So they're everywhere. PFAS don't break down over time and have contaminated drinking water and food. Research has linked them to cancer, heart and liver problems, developmental issues, and other health problems. Water tests show nearly 3,000 private wells located near 63 active and former U.S. military bases are contaminated with these forever chemicals at levels higher than what federal regulators consider safe for drinking. According to the Environmental Working Group, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit that analyzed Department of Defense testing data, 2,805 wells spread across 29 states were contaminated with at least one of two types of PFAS, above 4 parts per trillion, a limit proposed earlier this year by the EPA. So some of the bases that have been affected by PFAS contamination include the Marine Corps base at Camp Pendleton, Fort Leavenworth, Fort Knox, West Point U.S. Military Academy, Fort Hood, the Naval Submarine Base at Kings Bay, Robins Air Force Base, and Savannah International Airport. Testing at the Tucson International Airport Area Superfund site has revealed PFAS levels of up to 5,300 times beyond the drinkable limit, which is, quote, likely to enter into the Tucson public water system, according to the EPA. These chemicals likely originated from the use of AFFF, the firefighting foam, at airports and military sites such as the nearby Davis-Monthan Air Force Base and Morris Air National Guard Base. The EPA also identified other chemicals that migrated into the groundwater from a weapons manufacturing facility just south of Tucson operated by RTX, which is formerly known as Raytheon. The EPA has ordered cleanup on all of these sites, including the Tucson site, to restore the drinking water. But as my friend and colleague Nick Cleveland Stout points out in a new Responsible Statecraft article, the military is finding new and creative ways to avoid the full cost and energy of fulfilling those mandates. So welcome, Nick, to the show.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Great. I'm so much very interested in hearing your breakdown of this issue, but can you talk a little bit about the case in Tucson and how the Air Force is trying to avoid the cleanup there?
Yeah. So basically, as you mentioned, in April, the EPA said that there are now these legally enforceable limits. We've known these have been coming for a long time, and so the Pentagon, as many places, have had years to kind of prepare for what we knew were going to be legally enforceable limits. Only they probably weren't anticipating on the Pentagon trying to find kind of any loophole that they can find to get out of this. And so in this case, in the EPA ordered them to be able to basically clean up this groundwater in this Superfund site that could contaminate the drinking water of residents in Tucson and service members. And the Air Force just said no. They cited the overturning of this legal doctrine, the Chevron doctrine, which happened, I believe, just last month or maybe 2 months ago.
Very recently.
Yeah, very recently, after the April regulatory announcement by the EPA. And what the Chevron doctrine did was it gave deference to regulatory agencies to interpret gray areas in the law. And what's really odd about the Air Force citing this Supreme Court decision is that the decision typically applies to, the idea was it's going to apply to rulemaking and not enforcement. And this is very much in the latter category.
Right. Exactly. So what they're doing is they're focused on the legalistic responsibilities or the legalistic arguments and not so much the actual cleanup, what they're responsible for. So they found a way to tie this up in the courts, it sounds like.
Yeah, although what's interesting about it is because it's two different parts of the executive branch, the Guardian did some reporting. They talked to several lawyers about this, and the consensus that seems to be arising is like this can't go to the court because it's two branches of the same, or two different offices of the same branch. So it's going to have to be something that probably is settled internally, by the president or something like that. It's not exactly clear kind of like what precedent this sets, because it as of right now, there's a good chance that this just gets shot down. But actors outside of the government could try to do similar things. Businesses, things like that,
right,
could to sue the EPA or whatever it is. But yeah, there was one lawyer that was quoted in the Guardian's reporting that said basically this is an intimidation tactic of sorts, like just a sign that they're really pulling out all the stops to try and drag their feet on the cleanup here.
How much would this cleanup, or does this, how much would this set back the Air Force to fulfill its cleanup requirements in Tucson? And do we have any sense of how much this would typically cost the DoD, across the gambit of all of the sites that it's responsible for? What are we talking about here in terms of price tag?
Yeah. So to answer the first question, this isn't currently in the drinking water of Tucson, but as the EPA order mentioned, like this is very much a preventative measure. You don't want to have to, it's kind of like if your house is on fire, you want to be able to have a fire department. You want to have those preventative measures in place that can take care of it if it hits the fan. So, and this has happened before. The EPA mentioned in 2021 that the PFAS was very close to breaking through the system. They have this very old system of it's called GAC, this water treatment system that just isn't quite from my understanding, their system just isn't quite powerful enough to deal with the concentration levels of PFAS in the Superfund site right now. And it deals with some types of PFAS well, but because this is a family of chemicals that's, there are thousands of different types of chemicals and several that we know of just in the Superfund site. Like it deals with some of them well, some of the ones that are more well regulated and more well understood, but there's some that are likely or could enter the system. And so this is very much a preventative measure. In terms of the cost, what really struck me about the Air Force's defiance and going rogue here is that the alternative treatment system isn't even really that expensive to begin with. It's it's an estimated $25 million, which is really, pennies on the dollar for when we're talking about an entity like the Air Force or the Pentagon. Right. Just requested a budget of $850 billion. And so there are a few different questions, I think, when we talk about the costs attached. So, across the entire country, because on the cleanup side, the cost attached for what it would take to provide clean water to military communities that are impacted by this contaminated PFAS water due to this AFFF fire suppressant is around it's upwards of $30 billion. $38 billion is the DoD's most recent estimate, according to a government accountability office report that came out earlier this year. On the other hand, they also need to transition to using a foam that doesn't have PFAS, and that costs much less. That's like I think $2 billion. And so those are kind of early estimates that are emerging. They're very much subject to change. And it's also worth pointing out that like the DoD's own estimates are probably undercounting a lot of these things. And so, these estimates, it could go up. But again, like when we're talking about all of that together, like $40 billion, it's not that much when it, like in the grand scheme of things. When you look at how much the Department of Defense is asking for, like F-35s, sending aid across, to Ukraine and Israel.
$175 billion to Ukraine in the last 2.5 years. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so that cost would include the cleanup. Would it also include like transitioning to the new water treatment systems? I mean, what does that $38 billion include?
Yeah, I think it's mostly being able to they use this mechanism that like absorbs the PFAS molecules, and so the EPA's decision or the regulatory announcement makes it so that basically any location where the DoD is the purveyor of drinking water, which is a lot of different places, and it is above that 4 parts per trillion for the 6 chemicals that are now being regulated within the PFAS family. They need to create a system that provides clean drinking water below that limit. And so it's in some places it's a tall order, because there could be I think in your opening remarks, like you mentioned, there's a lot of different military installations that are well above that 4 parts per trillion, which I should know doesn't sound like a lot, but PFAS are very dangerous even in extremely trace amounts, and like even a tiny bit in the bloodstream can be pretty detrimental.
Oh yeah.
To people's health.
And Arizona might be an example of a base in which, like you mentioned, the PFAS contamination hasn't broken through to the water system, but other places have, in terms of experiencing the contamination directly in the water, the drinking water. For example, I believe Fort Bragg is one of the biggest and most prominent examples of contamination. And I believe that there's an ongoing lawsuit against the military there because it did not act fast enough to clean up before it affected people in that military community, which is really sad. Because as long as that I've been reporting on veterans issues and military family issues, Fort Bragg was always lifted up as an example of the military falling down on its obligations to create a safe living and working environment for military families. And of course, there's a whole community outside of the gates of the installation there that are also affected. So this is a highly entrenched problem in the military. And from what I understand, with my limited knowledge, I'm not a 24/7 researcher of this issue, but they've been dragging their feet for some time in terms of the cleanup, the responsibility. And I know you've written about some of the issues in some other states, but that this seems to be a familiar I guess, refrain coming from the military, where it is posed with a problem. There's tons of research and medical evidence, the scientific evidence, and they find ways to stall cleanup or retribution to families who have been harmed for as long as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely true, and it's also it's we should basically, like, we should be having this conversation, be in this period of transition, of moving towards a PFAS-free AFFF, having these conversations around legal obligations for cleanup. All of this should have been happening 30, 40 years ago. It's the Department of Defense knew as early as the 70s that this was detrimental. And I would say that, like, it probably wasn't even until like a few years ago that this really became something that was really within the public conscience. And that's sad, because it's, as you mentioned, it's affected a lot of people. You know, there are a lot of people who are dying of these ailments, you know, increased risk of cancer, reproductive issues, for decades that just shouldn't have happened. And a lot of us, you know, it's not like AFFF is not the only way that PFAS enters the bloodstream, but yeah, this is an issue that is very much heightened for military communities. And I think it wasn't even until 2011 that the Pentagon even publicly admitted that this was a huge health risk. You know, they were conducting all these studies towards the end of the Cold War, you know, on different animals, like seeing what kind of impact this chemical family had. They tested it on rainbow trout. They tested it on mice, and the effects were all the same. Like, you know, you can go, the environmental working group you mentioned has a great resource where anyone can go in and look at all these documents and look at the timeline, and you can see for yourself. Like, they were very upfront of like, hey, we tested it on this group of fish. They all died in 24 hours. Maybe we shouldn't be using this as often as we are. And part of, I mean, I should mention also that, like, initially there was a very good reason for, like, this is a product that works extremely well. You know, there was this big fire on an aircraft carrier in the late 60s, and something like over 100 service members died. And it was around that time that they decided, you know, we need something that is a little bit stronger, that is fire resistant. And so they came up with AFFF, and it became very widely used. But we're at a place where we now have some alternatives. Like,
that's what I don't understand. Like, there's alternatives. Why aren't they using them? Or are they, and they're just not consistently?
Yeah, so in 2020, Congress mandated the Pentagon to, and finally, I mean, they should have done it earlier, but Congress finally mandated the Pentagon to transition away from using AFFF that has PFAS by October of this year. So in theory, they have until October of this year to keep using it if they want, and then they can extend it for 2 years, which they've already indicated that they will. They told Congress in February that they have every intention of taking both of those extensions, and so they've been doing some. They basically posted kind of like an open ad for manufacturers, I think sometime last year, basically saying, we need to, you know, we have this legal obligation to do this. What do you guys got? And so military contractors or you know, chemical manufacturers, they could submit you know, their own patents for what a PFAS-free foam would look like. And this GAO report mentioned that there's now a few that have met the military specifications that the Department of Defense can use, and it's unclear exactly how, you know, to what extent those have been implemented. But this report, there were some indications from this report that seemed like it's not that widespread just yet. It said, like, for example, that they haven't entered into long-term contracts with these new manufacturers yet. You know, and they again, a little bit ironic given how much money the Pentagon has. They cited the cost again. Like, they talked about how the cost of the new foam is is marginally higher. I think it was like 16% higher than AFFF, which isn't a huge difference again. But yeah, that just is another example of kind of like how this is taking a while. And again, part of it is like the Pentagon is a huge institution, especially the Air Force, which is the branch that uses by far the most fire suppressants. So of course, like it takes time to train people with the new foam, make sure that it works just as effectively, in case of an accident. All these things, like, it does take time, but this, I think this example from Tucson sort of shows like, the Pentagon seems very much divided of like how seriously to take this, and
Right.
they're going to be dragging their feet on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, get your ass in gear. This idea that, okay, the wheels of the Pentagon bureaucracy turn very slowly. We understand that, but people's lives are at risk here, not just your own personnel and their families, but entire communities that have that live and work in the base, in the area of these bases that are sharing the drinking water. And, it's hard for me to stomach the idea that we are willing to give defense contractors 20, 30, 40% cost upgrades for building a new ship or a new jet fighter or some other big ticket weapon systems, but we're going to quibble over an increase in the cost of a firefighting foam when it's actually going to save lives of the people that you're responsible for. It makes no sense to me, other than I've been around long enough to see that this is how the government usually rolls, whether it be the burn pits, in which they slow rolled the incinerators that Congress mandated, that they put in place of the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. They slow rolled that. They maintained the burn pits years after Congress told them to shut them down. And what do we have now? We have veterans who have come home, have life-changing injuries, holes in their lungs, cancer, respiratory illnesses that will be chronic for the rest of their lives because the government slow rolled. And we saw this all the way back with Agent Orange in Vietnam, where they didn't want to even recognize that chemical had long-lasting health effects on not only our veterans, but entire generations of people in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So yes, this is an MO. I want to mention also that this isn't just about the AFFF, but munitions that are on these sites that leak into the groundwater over time. You did a story in 2021 for Responsible Statecraft about fuel leaks in the tap water at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, which is in Hawaii. And they've had consistent problems with the fuel tank that fuels, it's called the Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage Facility, and on Oahu, and had leaked several times over the last decade or so. And it's actually, the leaks have gotten into the drinking water there and are making people sick. And so you had written about a town hall. This is December 13th, 2021, in which residents in and outside of Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam confronted the military and said, listen, we're getting nausea, headaches, vomiting from our public water supply. And, that the Navy has been resistant there as well in terms of their responsibility of making sure that this facility isn't leaking. You mentioned the problem goes beyond Oahu. It's part of a pattern nationwide of the military's abdication of environmental responsibility. And you mentioned in 2017, the U.S. Naval Station in Virginia Beach spilled 94,000 gallons jet fuel in the Atlantic Ocean. And then you raise the whole issue of the PFAS. This is a huge problem, and I think thanks to a lot of researchers, the environmental group, reporters such as yourself and others, activists, I think we're finding out more about it. And military families themselves have been very active, and they're fighting this. And God love them, because I've heard stories. I've talked to mothers on bases whose children were suffering because of lead paint, asbestos, mold in the military housing. So this goes beyond drinking water. This goes for just an abdication of responsibility to the very people that you want to go out and fight your wars.
Right, right. I mean, these are the people that, like, what is the military for? It's to, the whole idea of it is to ensure the safety of Americans and protect the interests of the U.S. First and foremost among that should be the health of our people and our service members. I don't think that, people don't, this isn't something that people anticipate when they sign up for the military. And these are the people that are impacted by this the most. So yeah, it's amazing the kind of, mental gymnastics that the Pentagon will go through to try and avoid accountability for that. You mentioned Red Hill, in Honolulu, Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam. And the excuse that they used for not shutting that down initially was that it was an architectural marvel. That's something that they would lobby the Senate. We can't close. I know it's had these issues. There have been jet fuel leaks in the past. There was a massive one there in 2014. As you mentioned, there was another huge one in 2021. And they say it's like this, architectural marvel. It's this thing that we should all be in awe of, and we can't dare close it down. They eventually did, due to, as you mentioned, like the organization of activists, civil society groups, and the service members themselves, of course, who are complaining about this, and forcing people to actually take action. In that instance, the Secretary of the Navy was actually there for a commemoration, I think, of Pearl Harbor, and it just so happened that it was like while he was there that this huge leak happened, and he was kind of forced. It was like this rare instance where he was actually, because he was there, he was kind of forced to take accountability for it. And who knows what would have happened otherwise.
So they shut down the facility itself, or what did they end up doing?
So my understanding, and I haven't been following Red Hill quite as closely. I know that the Government Accountability Office had a separate report that was all about Red Hill. There have been some, so there, I think they've shut it down, and most of the, it seems like they haven't had nothing's leaked into the drinking water of residents there since then, since that huge jet fuel leak. But there are a lot of issues surrounding adequate testing, and so there are things that, like, we just don't know for sure whether whether the drinking water in certain areas is safe, because they're also, like, there's also a huge PFAS issue there. I know a lot of residents have raised the issue that there's significant amounts of PFAS in the groundwater. And so it's something definitely to watch. But yeah, the Pentagon did eventually close down that facility.
Yeah, I just looked it up. So just a few months after your story, after that big town hall meeting in which the Secretary of the Navy was confronted, in March 2022, they shut down the Red Hill fuel storage facility. So yeah, but it, like you said, it took the organization of residents confronting the military, and then, of course, all of the press that came out of that, for them to actually shut that thing down, even though it had systematic leaks over time into the drinking water there. Yeah, this is a huge issue. It's hard to get your arms around it, because as you mentioned, it's not just the firefighting foam. It could be fuel, it could be munitions, other contamination at these sites. And then you have, like, as I mentioned, the base housing. I mean, can you imagine enlisting in the Army, getting stuck in some ramshackle base housing, and then finding out that your baby is sick because there's a mold issue prevalent in the walls of that home, and when you try to confront base leadership about it, you're basically given, the hand. And that's exactly what's happened to a lot of military families, is that once they complain about what's happening, and they can confront leadership with the doctor's notices and what have you, other evidence, they are suddenly forced into this Byzantine process of the adjudication, which starts with probably a lot of emails and calls that are unanswered, and then having to hire lawyers. And it's like, wait a minute, this is America. My tax dollars, your tax dollars are paying for this, and they can't seem to get base housing that isn't killing or making wives, children, and service members, what have you, sick. It's just it's terrible. I'm glad that there's plenty of light being shed on it, but it does seem like it is an almost intractable problem at this point, given the number of bases out there, the number of service members, the bureaucracy itself. It's very difficult.
Right. And yeah, no, it's definitely an instance in which we need to kind of hold our leaders' feet to the fire,
Yeah.
and not just the Pentagon, but like, we need to. It's something that Congress and elected officials, we need to hold their feet to the fire too, ensure that they do everything that they can, because there are a number of things that could have been done years ago. And
Right.
there are a number of things that can still be done. Like, this is something that it's great that it's getting the attention that it is now. There's definitely a certain level of public awareness around the toxicity of these chemicals, and of AFFF. And we're in this period of transition, and to kind of get over that finish line, whatever that means, in ensuring that this doesn't happen to future service members. This is something that we need to follow and keep pushing for, because as this Tucson case shows, like, they will try everything that they can, or at least some people within the Pentagon will, to avoid accountability. And so there are things that can still be done. Like, the EPA has regulated 6 different types of PFAS, but that there's a whole family of PFAS out there, and it's not something that's going to go away in October of 2026, when the Air Force has to legally comply to transition away. And there's still going to be a lot of bases that need to be cleaned up. There's still going to be other kind of loopholes that the Air Force will probably look for. Whether it's like using a type of foam that has a different type of PFAS that isn't regulated, or trying to find these legal loopholes like the Chevron doctrine to avoid accountability. It's something that, as you mentioned, this is a pattern. It's happened from a lot of your reporting with the burn pits, downwinders. There's a whole host of issues where this is an unfortunate pattern, and a lot of it comes from our system of just allowing the Pentagon to kind of self-regulate. And it isn't just the Pentagon. Obviously, like the chemical manufacturers were also well aware of these issues. DuPont, 3M. But it's deeply unfortunate. And this conversation should have been happening decades ago.
Well, I'm glad our conversation is happening now, and I'm really happy that you are continuing to cover these issues for responsible statecraft. I think it's so important. So I just want to direct everybody who's listening or watching right now to go to my colleagues or go to Responsible Statecraft, search my colleague, Nick Cleveland Stout. He's got some amazing reporting on not just these issues, but other military, industrial, complex corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, the revolving door. He's an excellent reporter, and so I highly recommend you read his pieces. And Nick, I hope to have you back on the show at some point to not only talk about this, but some of the other work that you're doing to expose just the conflicts of interest and you know how the military industrial complex is letting the American people down.
Would love to. Thanks so much, Kelly.
Take care.